have decided to narrate a series of events that I experienced in various chapters. When I was in the military, it all began when I was 20 years old. Having just graduated as a junior officer in the prestigious military academy, I was then assigned to the 93rd Infantry Battalion, located in the heart of the mountains of Guerrero, in the municipality of Tlapa de Comon Fort. These types of units are referred to as fully operational, meaning they are always engaged in anti-narcotics operations. We would spend 7 or 8 months in the mountains, with only 2 or 3 days of rest before heading back up again. Upon arriving at the unit, all of the newly arrived officers were called by Major Castillo, who was the head of operations. He assigned each of us a section and informed us of the area where we would be operating. I proceeded to gather my equipment and weapons, and then met with my section. The sergeants urged their personnel to be ready to leave as soon as possible. At that moment, the senior officer called us again to have a meeting with the battalion commander, Colonel Juan Jose Varanda Rivera. He was going to provide us with the final instruction. Upon arriving with the colonel, he mentioned who would be designated to command a fixed operations base in CAC matters. He replied that it would be the Senior Lieutenant Bettencourt. I immediately noticed the disapproval of the colonel, who said that my position should be the Lieutenant Locadio, as Locadio had more field experience, who had come directly from the military college. However, he insisted on Bettencourt accompanying to get to know the terrain. It is worth mentioning that I felt bad at that moment, but orders are orders, so I went as an escort for the vehicles to take Lieutenant Locadio to his mission. Upon arriving in the village, I left him and proceeded to return to the battalion, not before passing through a village called Olinala. We stopped there. We went to purchase some items at a small store to eat and continue our journey. At that moment, a man around 60 years old approached me and said, "Don't travel on the 11th of December, the day of Saint Balthazar, and as the evil one roams freely during those dates." I simply thanked him and didn't pay much attention because it was only the 7th of December. We paid and left, and 4 days later, while I was on duty at the battalion, the sergeant in the command post radioed me urgently to contact the mayor of Olinala immediately. I called, and he informed me that some of our colleagues had been in an accident. Later, I went to the colonel's house next to the battalion to inform him about everything I had been told. He asked me why I was there and instructed me to take a Humvee and a platoon and head there immediately. When I arrived at the accident site, the was desolate. On the shore were some soldiers sprawled, others complaining, and others injured, gathering weapons. I instructed the sergeant next to me to organize the area and proceed with the collection of the armament. After a few minutes, the sergeant informed me that 11 weapons were missing. The driver was deceased, and the officer in charge was nowhere to be found. The truck had veered off the road and fell into a stream that was approximately about 40 centimeters deep. I saw a corporal who luckily only had scrapes, and I asked him what had happened. He told me that they had gone to a village to buy things, but found everything closed. They were on their way back to another village when a man approached them and said, "Don't leave. It's better to stay here at my house. Today is just another day." The officer remarked that it would be even worse if they found nothing to buy. So they hastened their pace to the other village along the road, and felt as if something had grabbed the truck by the tail and had led it into the stream, shaken and thrown to the ditch. It should be noted that there were no tire marks on the pavement. This means they were not speeding, and also when they fell, they heard a pack of dogs, but there were no houses or ranches nearby, and no dogs around. Then the ambulances and investigators started to arrive. I noticed by the ditch and managed to see a hand coming out from the back of the truck under the tire. There were soldiers and weapons missing. A total of 11 soldiers dead and 1 officer missing, without any logical explanation. A few minutes passed, and about 100 people from the town started to come, all walking with candles in their hands. At that moment, the man who had found me in the store said, "See what happened? They didn't believe and didn't listen, and the villain took them." I didn't reply, as I was bewildered by everything I was witnessing. Many were murmuring, saying that the villain had taken them, as people in the town heard how a pack of dogs had passed by, taking the spirits of those soldiers. A cold breeze ran through my body when one of my soldiers asked me where Lieutenant Leocadio was. I reacted and sent a platoon to find him. He couldn't be very far. In that moment, the colonel commander of the battalion was arriving with an escort and medical staff. The colonel ordered me and the remaining personnel, along with part of his escort, to go to the operations base, as only a squad was left alone. So I left the place, and on the way, in the distance, we saw a silhouette of a person. As we passed by, we noticed it was Lieutenant Leocadio. We stopped a few meters ahead. To our surprise, there was nothing but darkness. It was maybe around 3 in the morning, and we searched the area with lanterns but found nothing. We continued our journey, and upon reaching the operations base, the on-duty corporal came out. When I asked for updates, I shared the events that had occurred. I was told that about 30 minutes ago, Sub-Lieutenant Leocadio had arrived, looking for his wallet. He mentioned that he had forgotten it, and quickly left as he had left his helmet down the path, since our base was located on a small hill. I inquired how he appeared, if he had any injuries, or seemed unusual. He replied that there were none, except for the peculiar sight of 5 dogs following him. At that point, Fear began to grip us all, as many things seemed inexplicable. Therefore, we decided not to disembark from the vehicles and to stay awake until dawn. At sunrise, the operations chief radioed me, informing that he was on his way to provide 2 platoons to complete the section, and that I would assume command. We remained at that base for about 3 months, discussing each day the events of that night, including the sighting of Sub-Lieutenant Leo. Walking on the path alone, I remembered what the worker had told me about the dogs during those 3 months. He told the staff of the troop that at night they saw shadows on the soccer field at the base. But one Tuesday I remember a soldier named Samuel, to whom the Grim Reaper spoke. He told him that a lady approached him at night and said she was saying goodbye, and to be very careful since where we were had become a place touched by evil. After this, she left. We asked him what she was like, and he only said she was very beautiful and kind, which struck us as strange. The next day, I was ordered to move the vehicles to a place called San Juan, Puerto Montaña, a village in the municipality of Metlatonac in Guerrero. The main objective was to find and eliminate poppy plantations. This part of the experience becomes even more terrifying as we study the events I experienced alongside my troop. It was a challenging day to move to the point where I had been directed. It was truly a very drastic change, as the place we were sent to had a completely different climate. We went from a temperate climate to a cold one, where it drizzled all day, and sunny days were rare in the mornings. On top of the tarps we placed over the tents, there was a layer of ice. There is also a lot of fog in the area. I still remember the delicious coffee the cook made in the morning with cinnamon. It was relatively calm days, but with a lot of work, and there were many gullies infested with opium plantations. The operations base was located at the top of a pine forest and at the foothills of the hills near the town of San Juan, Puerto Montaña. This was close to the borders of Oaxaca and Guerrero. Next to the town was the cemetery, which we could see perfectly, as it was only about 150 meters away, in a straight line. One morning, while getting ready to go out on a reconnaissance mission, Sergeant John Amaya approached me and asked me to accompany him. Behind our camp, we stumbled upon what looked like a stone shrine, measuring around 1.5 meters in the shape of a pyramid. On top of the stones, there was blood and chicken feathers, but no meat or parts of the sacrificed animals, only the bird beaks. We were speechless, and no one said a word, except for him telling us to continue with our work and not pay attention. It was Saturday, and the plan was to return early from reconnaissance to rest and consider Sunday a recovery day, allowing the staff to wash and clean their weapons. We arrived around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and suddenly it started raining, and the temperature dropped rapidly. Everyone changed into dry clothes and wrapped up to seek shelter in our tents from the rain and cold. In my tent house, I recalled, but the campaign had a receiver which I turned on and lay down, falling deeply asleep. I don't even remember how long I slept, only waking up when the on-duty corporal, whom we called Parchisi, was shouting to alert me that something strange was happening. To the soldier, Parka, I went out immediately and found the medic soldier checking the pulse and vital signs. The soldier seemed lost when I saw him. So I asked Parka, "What's wrong?" His eyes turned to me. He sat down, took a deep breath, and said, "I'm fine, Commander. I just couldn't wake up. We kept him under observation all night, and everything was normal." The next day, I asked him what had happened. He replied that the silhouette of a woman stood next to him, preventing him from getting up and warning him of danger by placing her hand on his chest. I simply mentioned that it was probably a nightmare, and that I didn't need to worry anymore. As night fell, I gathered the section for a chat and to give instructions for the next day. After this, we retired to sleep. I was already very asleep when I heard a burst of gunfire. Immediately, I heard my section proceeding to establish the defense plan. I crawled out of my tent and shouted to the corporal on duty to tell me who had fired. He said it had been someone from the west side of the base, so we waited 5 minutes to see if the gunfire continued. We waited and waited, and all we could hear was the cold wind passing through the branches of the pines. I gathered a squad and went to see who had fired. When I arrived and shone my lamp where the lookout post was, I saw him sitting there with the weapons between his legs, leaning against a trunk with his pants all wet from fear. It was the timid soldier. I spoke to him and asked timidly, "What's wrong?" He just raised his hand, pointing ahead. I arrived at the cemetery that was located in that area and saw 3 dogs walking. Suddenly, they turned, and their eyes glowed in the light of the lamps. I just looked at the Grim Reaper and said, "How scared you are." That's how dogs' eyes look when they are lit up with a lamp. As soon as I finished saying this, one of the animals stood on 2 legs, and then started walking like a human. I couldn't believe it. I didn't really know what was happening, and I couldn't even tell if what we were seeing was real. There was no doubt that that 4-legged creature had stood up and was walking on 2 legs like a human, taking 1 step at a time. Its appearance was more like an ordinary dog, and as it looked back at us, it walked towards the cemetery. It wasn't logical, and certainly not natural. Fear took hold of us, leaving us motionless and unable to say a word. Finally, I was able to move and grab my weapon to aim at the creature. Hold the trigger, and right there, that beauty too. The ship done a the shot on what's on the Jeb Juddy. Gamin got it. Katsuwaya. Only a click was heard, but the cartridge did not fire, and the cartridge came out of the chamber, shot to the side. Then, another click was heard suddenly. One of my sergeants, who was next to me, placed his hand on the weapon and said, "It's useless, Commander. It won't fire. Lower it." Then let's get out of here. I lowered the weapon, and we headed back to the camp. I remember that the members of the platoon stopped him and carried him back to camp. Upon arrival, I instructed the sergeants to gather as much firewood as possible and build a bonfire. We formed a circle with our backs to the light, sitting and waiting for dawn. Everyone was silent, not making any comments. As the first rays of sunlight began to appear, the communications corporal, known as Traka, in the army, requested a conference with the operations chief. I immediately told him to turn on his radio and call the battalion. Approximately half an hour later, the chief of operations answered. I replied, "Good day. This is Q. Castillo checking in. I request to be relocated to another area by my own means. As the plantations are far from my current location, although that was just an excuse to leave the place, they authorized me, and we immediately proceeded to dismantle the camp and organize ourselves to leave. I was restless and impatient with what I saw because I didn't know if it was real or not, so I told the corporal to gather his squad. Once he gathered his squad, we headed towards the cemetery where we had seen the dogs. It was already daytime, one of the few days when the sun had come out beautifully in the mountains. Upon reaching the outskirts of the cemetery, I told the corporal, "Let's take a walk and see what we find." We explored the cemetery and noticed it looked completely abandoned. At that moment, I saw a soldier bend down and pick something up. The corporal yelled at him to leave it and it would be better not to touch it. So I hurried to see what had been picked up. And upon seeing it lying on the ground, it felt like an icy block had fallen on my back. There was the Sub-Lieutenant Leocadio's wallet. We quickly withdrew from the place, wondering how it had ended up there. It is worth mentioning that where they had the accident and where we were was approximately a day and a half of travel by vehicle. There was no logical explanation as to why we were finding the wallet in the graveyard. I arrived at the camp, and the people were already prepared. So I instructed the sergeants to start moving towards the new coordinates I had given them. On the way, we came across a truck selling fruits and vegetables that was stuck. The driver asked for our help, and we gladly assisted in getting the truck out. The driver had an indigenous appearance and kindly asked us where we were from. I replied that we were coming from the small village behind us. On that hill, he became a bit pensive and mentioned, "Didn't they cause harm to them?" "What harm?" I replied. "It's just that in that town, there's a lot of sorcery. That's why hardly anyone comes to these places, except those who sow bad grass. Be very careful. The people who have come here always bring something bad with them." My mind kept spinning, trying to connect the dots of what was happening, when suddenly I felt that we were arriving at the meeting point where we were going to settle. 3 months had passed since that situation, and for many of us, we were starting to overcome it. One night, I gathered my whole section. We were around the bonfire, and it was very cold. Everyone was having coffee with animal-shaped cookies, since there was nothing else in the camp. The night was normal, until we heard a growl in the distance. We thought it might be some animal, as in the area there were rumors of a real puma. I told the person I was careful when it was their turn to stand guard. We went to sleep and turned on my radio to listen to the nightly news that I could barely tune in on the AM frequency. At some point, I fell asleep. The next day, the wake-up time was 6 a.m. But I realized it was actually 9 in the morning. I got up angrily and ready to scold the corporal on duty because he hadn't gotten up. As he should have. To my surprise, I discovered that we had all fallen asleep. Absolutely no one had woken up. The guards, the people, no one woke up. And the strangest thing was that the alarms on our watches didn't go off. I started shouting for everyone to wake up and saw that the corporal on duty, also known as Parcheesi, was lying on top of the sacks of flour. I called him out and started reprimanding him when a sergeant informed me that the soldier, La Parka, was missing. I immediately sent his platoon to search, thinking that maybe he had gone to the bathroom. While I demanded explanations from the corporal, the reason for why he had fallen asleep was questioned, to which he replied that he didn't know why. The guards had also not noticed, so we spent the entire night on watch. Some time passed, and they returned to look for the soldier. Grim Reaper informed me that there was no trace of him, so I decided to grab 2 squads and leave one at the base to continue the search. The strangest thing was that his weapon and gear were still at the base. Even his boots were there. It was impossible for him to have left barefoot. We searched all day, and at night, we returned to the base, firing into the air several times to see if the sound would help him locate us and come back. We prepared to sleep. So that the next day, we could continue the search. At around 5 in the morning, we had breakfast and went to look for the Grim Reaper again, hoping to find him. Although in my mind I was already imagining the worst, we all wondered how it was possible that no one had seen him leave, or how we had all stayed asleep, unable to wake up again. All our efforts to find our companion were in vain. We didn't even find a trace of him. We arrived at night with our morale low. And I told him if by 2 in the afternoon tomorrow we don't find him, send a radiogram saying that Soldier Park left the operations base. That night, there was an unusual cold in the air. Not sure if due to concern or the fear creeping back into our thoughts. I entered my tent and got into my sleeping bag, starting to pray that wherever he was safe. Hours passed, and I couldn't sleep. So I left the tent and went to the bonfire where the duty corporal was. I asked him to pour me some water for coffee, and he said it was already prepared since no one had taken any. So I poured myself some and lit a cigarette. The corporal's last name was Rooster. He began to talk.